The Crusades, one of the most well-known and talked about events in world history. We've all heard the glorified tales. The brave knights donning shining armor, marching under religious banners, and fighting for the holy cause of reclaiming Jerusalem. But what if I told you that these famous crusades weren't just about noble knights and pious intentions? What if, behind the so-called sacred wars, there was a dark side to Crusader armies, filled with shocking crimes and atrocities that have been largely hidden from the public eye for centuries? Stay with me because what you're about to learn about the Crusader Army's crimes might just change everything you thought you knew about this chapter in history. The Crusades, a series of religious wars fought mainly between Christians and Muslims, spanned over 200 years, beginning in the late 11th century and continuing to the 13th century. The driving idea behind these wars was a belief that the Holy Land, specifically Jerusalem, had been taken by Muslims and needed to be reclaimed for Christianity. With the backing of the Pope and the promise of eternal salvation, Christian knights, soldiers, and common people took up arms in what was considered a holy cause. However, the history of the Crusades, as we typically learn it, is often focused on the idea of Christians fighting to free Jerusalem from Muslim control, depicting the Crusaders as pious warriors. But the truth of what happened during these campaigns is far darker. Underneath the religious banners and promises of glory lay a disturbing reality. In the name of God, the Crusader armies committed some of the most heinous acts of violence, brutality, and cruelty ever witnessed in history. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the shocking crimes that occurred during the Crusades, crimes that went far beyond the battlefield and left deep scars on both the Crusader and Muslim worlds. The mass killings, the destruction of cities, the plundering of sacred lands, and the widespread human suffering that occurred during these wars are often left out of popular stories. We're here to uncover the truth behind the Crusader Army's bloodstained legacy and shed light on these long-forgotten dark deeds. You might think you know the story, but there's much more to the Crusades than meets the eye. The First Crusade, the start of something dark. The First Crusade, which began in 1096, is the one that set the stage for all the subsequent Crusades. Pope Urban II's call to arms had a powerful religious motivation. Christians were to reclaim Jerusalem, the holy city, from Muslim rule. But the violence and horrors that followed were anything but righteous. The Crusaders, driven by promises of salvation, often committed horrendous acts along their journey. And the attacks against Muslim populations were only a small part of what occurred. Before the Crusaders even reached the Holy Land, they attacked and slaughtered Jewish communities across Europe. One of the most infamous events was the Rhineland massacres in 1096, where thousands of Jews were killed by Crusaders who saw them as enemies of Christianity. These people were murdered, their homes destroyed, and their synagogues burned to the ground. For the Crusaders, this was just the beginning. They believed that their religious duty justified these brutal acts, and so they massacred anyone they considered a threat to their cause. By the time they reached the Holy Land, the violence of the Crusader armies was already on full display. When they arrived in the city of Nicaea, they besieged the city and killed many civilians, both Christian and Muslim. The bloodshed in the streets was only a prelude to the terror that was about to unfold in Jerusalem. In 1099, after a long and grueling siege, the Crusaders took control of Jerusalem. What followed was one of the most shocking massacres in history. As the Crusaders entered the city, they slaughtered anyone they found, Muslim and Jewish civilians, as well as the few remaining Christian inhabitants. The streets of Jerusalem ran with blood, and Crusaders were reported to be wading through it up to their ankles. No one was spared. The elderly, women, and children were brutally killed, and the bodies were left in the streets. Some accounts even say that the Crusaders took the bodies of their victims and threw them into the city's wells. The massacre of Jerusalem, one of the darkest chapters of the First Crusade, marked the beginning of the Crusaders' bloody conquest of the Holy Land. The carnage wasn't just confined to the city. It was a demonstration of the religious zeal and willingness to do anything in the name of God. This brutality became a hallmark of the Crusader armies, and the cruelty they showed was nothing short of shocking. The Second Crusade, the cycle of violence continues. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147, was a response to the fall of the county of Edessa, a Christian-controlled city in the Holy Land. This time, the Crusaders were led by some of the most famous European monarchs, including King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany. However, as with the First Crusade, their efforts would be marred by a pattern of violence, bloodshed, and unnecessary cruelty. The Crusaders' first major campaign during the Second Crusade was the Siege of Damascus in 1148. The Crusaders, instead of focusing solely on military targets, started attacking the civilians living in the city. This was not a military operation aimed at gaining strategic control of the city. This was a direct assault on the civilian population. Homes were burned, civilians were murdered, and entire neighborhoods were wiped out. Many historians note that the Crusaders looted the city and killed anyone they came across, leaving behind a trail of destruction and terror. The cruelty didn't end there. Throughout the Second Crusade, Crusader armies continued to attack noncombatants. In cities like Lisbon and other parts of Spain, the Crusaders conducted violent raids, slaughtering men, women, and children. They looted religious sites and stole sacred treasures, all while justifying their actions with the belief that they were fighting for God's glory. What made this even more disturbing was that the Crusaders had learned little from the first wave of violence. Instead of focusing on the original goal of reclaiming the Holy Land, they had begun to spread terror far beyond Jerusalem, bringing death and destruction to towns and cities that had nothing to do with the conflict. Their actions in Damascus were a clear indication that the Crusades had become more about power, greed, and violence than any kind of holy mission. The Children's Crusade, exploiting innocence. One of the most tragic and shocking episodes of the Crusades was the Children's Crusade of 1212. Thousands of young children, some as young as 7 or 8, were convinced that they could peacefully reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. They were promised that they would be able to walk into Jerusalem without any violence. This naive belief led them into one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in history. The destruction of Constantinople was one of the most significant betrayals in the history of the Crusades. Instead of fighting to protect Christianity, the Crusaders turned their weapons on their fellow Christians. The sacking of Constantinople left a permanent scar on the relationship between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, which has lasted to this day. The legacy of the Crusades, a dark chapter in history. The Crusades left behind a legacy that still impacts the world today. The violence and brutality of the Crusader armies created deep rifts between different religious and cultural groups, especially between Christians and Muslims. The bloodshed, the massacres, and the betrayals during these wars were not just isolated incidents. They shaped the course of history. One of the most lasting impacts of the Crusades was a long-standing mistrust and hostility between the Christian and Muslim worlds. The Crusaders' actions, particularly the brutal massacres in Jerusalem and other cities, fueled hatred and resentment that continues to affect relations between the West and the Middle East today. The Crusades were not just about territorial conquests. They were about the establishment of power through violent means, and this legacy is one that has contributed to centuries of conflict. In addition, the Crusades set a dangerous precedent for using religion as a justification for violence. The idea that people could carry out mass killings in the name of God and be forgiven for doing so would echo through history. From the religious wars of the Reformation to modern-day conflicts, the lessons of the Crusades would shape the violent, politically driven religious wars that followed. The aftermath of the Crusades, shocking consequences and continuing tensions. While the Crusades were fought for religious reasons, their aftermath wasn't just limited to religious divisions. The impacts of these wars reach far beyond the battlefields and still resonate in the modern world. One of the most significant consequences of the Crusades was the lasting cultural, political, and economic divide they created between the Christian West and the Muslim East. The violence, brutality, and betrayal committed by the Crusaders left deep scars on both sides. For Muslims, the Crusades were a period of constant war and suffering. The memory of the Crusader massacres in cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Damascus became a symbol of oppression and loss. The resentment felt by the Muslim world lasted centuries and still informs the historical narrative surrounding Western involvement in the Middle East. The Crusaders were not seen as noble knights fighting for religious purity, but as invaders who were willing to slaughter innocent people to further their political and religious agendas. On the other hand, the Crusades also left a significant impact on the Christian world. While the Crusaders believed they were acting in the name of faith, their actions cast a shadow over the concept of religious war. The wars were a disturbing reminder that religion could be twisted to justify cruelty and inhumanity. Many of the Crusader leaders, after carrying out their bloody campaigns, went back home with wealth and power, but the true cost of their actions was a betrayal of the very ideals they claimed to protect. Crusader violence as a precedent for future wars. The brutality of the Crusades set a dangerous precedent for future religious conflicts. The idea that war could be waged in the name of God would echo throughout history, influencing everything from the religious wars of the Reformation to modern-day conflicts. The concept of holy war was deeply ingrained in the mindset of many future leaders, justifying actions that might otherwise be seen as unjustifiable. For example, the Inquisition, which sought to root out heresy within the Christian Church, was influenced by the brutal tactics of the Crusades. The idea that violence could be used to defend religious orthodoxy would become a common thread in religious conflicts throughout Europe and the Middle East. As the Crusaders expanded their territorial holdings, they were not just fighting for land, but for the destruction of entire cultures, which led to centuries of mistrust and violence between different religious and ethnic groups. This pattern of violence continued long after the Crusades ended. In later centuries, wars would be waged on the same premise, that those fighting in God's name were justified in carrying out brutal and cruel acts. The legacy of the Crusades would inform the thinking of religious extremists for centuries, making it all the more urgent for modern society to recognize the dangers of using religion as a justification for war and violence. The role of the Catholic Church and political manipulation. Another important aspect of the Crusades that is often overlooked is the role of the Catholic Church in manipulating the religious fervor of the people. The Church was not just a religious institution, but a powerful political force that controlled the flow of information and influenced the lives of millions. The call to arms was not only a spiritual matter, but also a means for the Church to assert its power and authority. Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade was a masterstroke in political manipulation. It gave the Church the ability to rally both knights and peasants to fight for a holy cause, promising them both spiritual rewards and earthly wealth. What was sold to the people as a chance for redemption became an excuse for pillaging, massacres, and the pursuit of power. The Church used the Crusades to strengthen its control over European monarchs, even as it sent armies into the heart of the Muslim world. The Church's manipulation of the Crusades would continue throughout the entire period. While some Crusaders may have genuinely believed they were fighting for their faith, many were simply pawns in a larger political game. By promising eternal salvation, the Church ensured that people followed their leaders into battle without questioning the moral implications of their actions. This manipulation of religion for political gain became one of the most devastating aspects of the Crusades. The economic motivations behind the Crusades. It's also important to acknowledge the economic motivations behind the Crusades. While religious rhetoric was used to justify the violence, there were significant material benefits to be gained by those who participated in the campaigns. The Crusaders were promised lands, wealth, and privileges upon their successful conquests. Many knights and soldiers were driven by the prospect of land in the Holy Land, where they could establish themselves as lords and gain economic power. The looting of cities was another significant economic motivation. When the Crusaders captured cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople, they looted them for treasure, artifacts, and valuable resources. This wealth was sent back to Europe, where it further fueled the ambitions of Crusader states and their European backers. The riches from the Crusades played a significant role in the rise of powerful families and noble houses across Europe. However, this wealth came at a terrible price, as it was obtained to the suffering and death of countless innocent people. This economic drive was a major factor in the perpetuation of the Crusades, as it made war seem like a profitable enterprise. The idea of war as a way to gain wealth and land further distorted the original religious goals of the Crusaders. For many, it became less about faith and more about the material rewards of conquest. In conclusion, the Crusades were far more than a series of religious wars fought to reclaim holy lands. They were marked by violence, betrayal, and inhumanity. Crusader armies, driven by a mixture of religious fervor, greed, and political ambitions, carried out some of the most shocking and brutal crimes in history. The massacre of civilians, the exploitation of children, and the betrayal of fellow Christians are only a few examples of the horrific acts committed during these wars. The legacy of the Crusades continues to affect the world today, and it is crucial that we understand the full history of these events. The stories of heroism and religious zeal often overshadow the crimes that took place, but it's important to acknowledge the darkness that also existed during this period. Understanding this complex history allows us to learn from the past and recognize the potential dangers of religious extremism. If you found this video insightful and want to continue exploring history's untold stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'll dive deep into more hidden truths and lesser-known chapters of history. Drop a comment below if you want to explore any other events or topics. And don't forget to like and share this video with anyone interested in the dark, untold side of history. Thank you for watching, and as always, keep learning, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.